Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is my Forbes colleague, senior editor Dan Alexander. Dan, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thank you for having me.
You were back in New York City in Manhattan this week in a courthouse watching Trump's fraud case. What can you tell us?
Gosh, it was a wild week. I mean, the first thing was when Michael Cohen took the stand. Obviously, there's a ton of interest. This is Donald Trump's former personal attorney. And then sparks flew. So you had at one point Michael Cohen admitting under oath that he lied in previous proceedings. Then you had him going back and saying, actually, in one of those previous proceedings, my testimony was accurate. It's just that Donald Trump, he didn't tell me explicitly to lie about the value or to inflate his assets. He basically works like a mob boss, and we knew what he meant when he said, I'm worth more than what you have listed down. And then our job was to go back and inflate the assets. And we knew that it wasn't sort of an explicit him saying, go do this. So that was interesting. Then you had, at one point, a lot of controversy over the partial gag order in the case. So Donald Trump has a gag order that prevents him from talking about the clerk who sits right next to the judge during the proceedings. And despite that, he went out in the hallway in the middle of one of the day's proceedings and basically said this judge is super biased, and the person alongside him who might be more partisan. And then the judge called him back out and said, who were you talking about? And Trump's lawyers said that he was talking, in fact, about the witness on the stand, Michael Cohen, not about the judge's clerk. And then the judge held an impromptu hearing, put Donald Trump under oath, called him up to the witness stand, asked him who he was talking about. He also claimed that he was talking about Michael Cohen. The judge did not find that credible and fined him $10,000 then and there. So all sorts of fireworks. I was talking to other people who spent a ton of time in courtrooms who said basically that they had never seen a day quite like that.
Well, that's interesting. At least you were entertained, I guess. But I'm very, to say the least, to say the absolute least. But I'm curious about Michael Cohen's behavior in court as well as Trump's. What was Trump's body language like when Michael Cohen was on the stand, and what was Michael Cohen's like? Because as we all know, those two were very close for years. Michael Cohen was considered Trump's fixer, and now he's turning against him.
Yeah, so Cohen was on the stand for 2 different days this past week. On the first day that he was on the stand, I would say Trump came in, he looked angry. He was focused, just mad. And Cohen came in looking like he was enjoying the day, like he was happy to be testifying against his former boss. Obviously, when he got on the stand, it's a serious matter, but Cohen was not so tense that he was not jousting with the counsel, Trump's current counsel, a role that he knows well. And basically acting like a lawyer, even though he was, in that case, a witness on the stand. So he was calling objections on things, and he was citing court precedents on things. And he seemed to be having a good time. The next day, I would say that the demeanors of both of them changed. Trump seemed much more relaxed. Cohen started out, appearing comfortable and confident. He was facing tough cross-examination during the second day, and at certain points got confused about what he was responding to, what exactly his answers were. His testimony seemed to be contradictory at certain points, and I think he still walked away with a confident demeanor. But certainly Trump's lawyers had, undermined some of his credibility through their questioning. And Trump, there was one really remarkable moment where Cohen basically gave some key testimony that helped Trump's side. Trump's lawyers then asked for the case to be ended on the spot. The judge said in this tone, denied. Trump stood up from his table and walked out of the room. Now remember, there aren't that many people in the room. and a lot of them are Secret Service or other security personnel. So all of them immediately went on high alert, stood up. The whole place kind of froze when Trump got up. He walked out. His son Eric, who's also defending the case, immediately followed him, and everything kind of paused, but the proceedings were still going on. So then, after everyone kind of caught their breath, they got back to action and continued the questioning of Michael Cohen.
Dan, thanks for being our eyes in the courtroom there. You touched on this last week when you were there, but I'm curious, as this week unfolded, did Trump's demeanor change when he was in the courtroom versus when he was in front of the cameras?
Absolutely. Trump in the courtroom, although he is expressive in certain ways, throwing his hands up at different points. At one point he had to testify, of course, but he's a relatively quiet presence. I mean, elephant in the room couldn't fit better for this moment. Everyone's watching him, but his role is sitting and watching everyone else, watching the witnesses testify, watching his lawyers do what they do. When he walks outside of that courtroom, he's the star. I mean, literally, when the doors open, it's like a nightclub. Just bulbs flashing everywhere. Boom, 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 boom. Trump walks out. People screaming questions, and he'll sort of gather himself and then boom into whatever responses he's going to give or whatever statement he's going to give. Sometimes it's short, sometimes it's long, but there's no question that yes, everybody's eyes are on him in the courtroom, but he's not the star. Once he steps out, he's the star.
Based on what you've seen, based on what you've witnessed in court, as we all know, Trump is far and away the front runner in 2024. Some polls even have him beating President Biden. Based on what you saw, based on his legal troubles, do you think that this will have any impact on 2024?
Certainly it'll have impact. Anything that's a major case like this is going to have impact. Now, does that mean that Donald Trump's not going to win the Republican nomination? No, I don't think so. If you're saying impact is it going to have a determinative effect on either the Republican primary or the general election? I'm skeptical of that. I think that at this point, people understand Trump has serious legal issues, and people who support him generally support him despite those. People who don't aren't going to be, shocked that he's in legal trouble. But that being said, elections are close affairs often, and swings of a half a percentage point do matter. And will this case, along with the criminal cases that he's facing, ultimately hurt him in the general election? We'll find out, but it's hard to imagine that it doesn't turn at least a few votes.
I do now want to pivot to your most recent piece for Forbes. I'm going to read you a passage from it, and then if we could dive into it. You wrote this: Deutsche Bank believed Trump's profits at one property were nearly triple the amount listed on an income statement. Does the discrepancy reflect accounting inconsistencies or something more sinister? Dan, to start off, why is the math not mathing here?
So basically, what we got to see is some of the documents that were coming out in this case were Deutsche Bank credit reports. This is their understanding of who their client was and what his financial situation was. If you go through those reports, one of the shocking things is how many things they have wrong, just blatant inaccuracies. Number of stories on a floor, square footage of a building, but perhaps most importantly, the profitability of certain properties. Now, what we did is we took what Deutsche Bank's understanding was of the profitability of certain properties, and then we compared it to other documents. So, for instance, the Trump National Doral in Miami. This is a golf resort in Miami. So we had filed a Freedom of Information request to get some financial information from local authorities in Miami. And as part of that request, we received income statements that the Trump organization had filed in concert with a property tax appeal that it was making in Miami. If you put the income statement that the Trump organization filed as part of that property tax appeal up against the income statement that Deutsche Bank believed for the same property over the same time periods, you see enormous discrepancies. So then the question becomes, okay, well, what's causing these discrepancies? And, I contacted the Trump organization. They listed a couple of things that may have been listed on one of the documents and not on the others. Ultimately, though, that still didn't make the math work. The discrepancy was too big, even if you included all of those things and were generous about it and said, okay, every single year the maximum amount we're going to attribute over here. It still didn't add up. At the very least, when you look at these two documents, you see bad accounting, inconsistent practices, numbers that just don't make sense even within the same document. And at the worst, you have to wonder, are those discrepancies between the documents the result of something more nefarious? In other words, that they were intentionally deceiving their lender or the tax authorities.
Dan, I love reading your reporting because you are the straightest shooter and you don't mince words here. You write this. Fiddling with figures like net operating income is a big deal. Can you explain just how big of a deal that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're a lender and you have a loan against a property, your principal concern is this property going to throw off enough income so that then the person who borrowed money from me can pay back the money that they owe? And that there's a ratio there. What's the profits to what's the amount of money that they have to pay back? That ratio is called the debt service coverage ratio. It's a long technical term for basically, is this person going to have the dough to pay me back? And banks look at what that ratio is very carefully. Now, if your income drops significantly or is significantly lower than what your lender believes it is, then that throws off that ratio. And that ratio is one of the key financial components and covenants that the borrower has to keep when borrowing money. So if the ratio drops below a certain level, then that triggers an event of default. In this case, if you look at the numbers that Deutsche Bank believed Trump was earning at Trump National Doral, the golf resort in Miami, that was plenty of money to cover the debt service coverage ratio. However, if you look at the same figures, the net operating income that were filed on local tax appeals, that number would then drop the debt service coverage ratio below the threshold that it had to hit as part of the financial covenants associated with this loan. And that would trigger an event of default for Donald Trump, according to these documents. So you have a big deal here where, yeah, it's a small number and it sounds like, a couple $1 million, this is a billionaire. But wait a second. If you change those numbers, all of a sudden it could spark an event of default with Donald Trump's primary lender, Deutsche Bank. That could have ripple effects in the rest of his business. So little number, big deal overall.
And is there any evidence that directly links former President Donald Trump to these numbers not adding up?
Well, they're his properties, of course. And Donald Trump for years has said public numbers that are not true in terms of what his properties are worth, in terms of how much money they're throwing off, in terms of what their size is, that sort of thing. Now, Donald Trump also was required to sign documents over the years affirming that certain financial information that he was submitting to his banks was accurate. However, the numbers that we're looking at most closely here are when Donald Trump was president. Now, when he was president, he put his assets in a trust. He still owned it all, which was basically a shell entity. And Alan Weisselberg, his former chief financial officer, and Donald Trump Jr., his son, were the two trustees of that trust. We don't have paperwork showing that Donald Trump in 2017 and 18 was signing off on the documents that showed different numbers in one place and different numbers in another. Yes, they're his assets. It's all his money. He still all owned it, but we just haven't seen that paperwork yet. It would make sense if instead either Alan Weisselberg or Don Jr. were signing off on that paperwork because they were the trustees of the trust at that time.
In your reporting for Forbes, the title is Bad Accounting or Fraud. So let's say this is fraud. What happens to Donald Trump if it is figured out that these numbers here, because they didn't add up, they were purposefully fudged?
Yeah, well, we'll see. Obviously, he's facing a massive fraud case right now, one over the valuation of his assets. This would seem to be something a little bit different, misleading a bank, not just about what the values are, but about what the underlying operating income and profitability is of a particular asset. But there's a lot of steps between now and where he would actually face consequences. So first of all, you would have to have an investigator say, okay, this is concerning enough that we're going to open up an investigation. Then you would have them open up an investigation. They would have to ask the Trump Organization. The Trump Organization would theoretically have to give more complete and more explicable explanations than they gave me that actually made these numbers add up. If they didn't, then they would look further. Perhaps they would launch a lawsuit. Then you'd have a lawsuit. Then you'd have a judgment. So we're a long, long way from him seeing any consequences from this sort of thing. But nonetheless, it shows a consistent pattern of behavior where throughout his business, you see numbers in one place and numbers in a different place that just don't quite line up.
Dan, I appreciate you crunching the numbers. I appreciate your reporting. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.